The addition of the 7th Marines to the Lunga garrison and the arrival of more aircraft at Henderson Field made possible an improvement of the Lunga Point defences. For the first time, General Vandergrift was able to establish a complete perimeter defence. On 19 September, he divided the Lunga area into 10 sectors. Defences of the 7 inland sectors on the west, east and south were strengthened by the addition of infantry battalions. 2 battalions constituted the division reserve. Each infantry regiment was to maintain 1 battalion in reserve, under regimental control but available for commitment by division headquarters if necessary. The 3rd Defence Battalion, commanded by Colonel Pepper, with the 1st Special Weapons Battalion attached, continued to be responsible for providing beach and anti-aircraft defence. Each night the 3 beach sectors were to be strengthened by men of the Pioneer, Engineer and Amphibian Tractor battalions who performed their regular duties during the day and helped to man the beach lines after dark. The defence thus established was generally circular. Though some areas could not be strongly held, there were no exposed flanks and no large gaps. The southern inland area still posed problems which could not be completely solved. Positions on open ridges could be organised in depth, but on the low ground the dense vegetation prevented the establishment of completely mutually supporting positions. There were not enough men to carry out the enormous task of clearing fields of fire for a line which ran through 14,000 yards of jungle. Whenever possible, the main line of resistance followed the hills and ridges. The field fortifications included foxholes and splinter-proof machine gun emplacements of logs and sandbags. Sufficient barbed wire had been brought to the Marines to enable them to begin to wire in the whole front behind 2 bands of double-apron fence, with tripwires between the bands. The 11th Marines, strengthened by the 75mm pack howitzers of the 1st Battalion, remained grouped inside the perimeter to provide fire support to all sectors. Although this cordon defence was far from ideal, it provided strong firepower and presented a continuous line to prevent enemy infiltration. It was vulnerable to intensive artillery fire, but as General Vandergrift observed, the Japanese demonstrated a lack of efficiency and a low order of professional technique in the use of artillery. The division was now ready to take the offensive. After the vicious ridge engagement, division headquarters knew that a sizable enemy force was operating from Matanikau village west of the river, in Kokumbona, and was occasionally patrolling Mount Austin. These troops were from the 4th Infantry of the 2nd Division and the Kawaguchi Force. The rest of the 4th Infantry had landed west of the Matanikau in mid-September to join forces with its 2nd Battalion. Reasonably sure that the Japanese could offer no immediate threat to the south and east sectors, the 1st Division planned to clear the enemy out of the areas to the west by a series of offensives in regimental strength. Once those in the Matanikau area had been driven out or destroyed, the division would be able to establish defence positions to keep the Japanese beyond striking distance of Lunga Point. The first plan called for operations by the newly arrived 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, and the 1st Raider Battalion. Lieutenant Colonel Lewis B. Puller commanded the 1st Battalion of the 7th Marines. The Raiders were then commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Samuel B. Griffith, 2nd. Colonel Edson, recently promoted to full colonel's rank, had taken command of the 5th Marines on 21st September, after Colonel Hunt's departure for the United States. On 23 September, Colonel Puller's battalion was to proceed southwest to Mount Austin, advance west along its northern slopes, and cross the Matanikau inland to patrol the area between the river and Kokumbona. This patrol action was to be concluded by 26 September. On that day, the raiders were to advance west along the coast road to establish a temporary patrol base at Kokumbona, where several inland trails intersected the coast road. Control of Kokumbona would not only deny a good landing beach to the Japanese, but would also prevent them from using the trails to advance inland. The 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, passed through the perimeter defence line on 23 September. Upon reaching the Mount Austin area, it surprised and scattered a Japanese force shortly after sunset on 24 September. The battalion was reinforced by the 2nd Battalion of the 5th Marines the next morning. 2 companies of the 1st Battalion were detached to escort the Marine wounded back to the perimeter. The main body of Puller's force moved slowly toward the Matanikau and reached the river the next day, 25 September. As Colonel Puller had been ordered to conclude his patrol on 26 September, he did not cross the Matanikau, but turned north and patrolled along the east bank to the river mouth, where he intended to cross the river. When the force reached the mouth, it started across the sandbar, but was forced back by heavy Japanese mortar fire from the west bank. The colonel called for and received artillery support, but the fire failed to dislodge the Japanese, who were strongly entrenched in carefully prepared positions. The 1st Raider Battalion had meanwhile reached the river mouth en route to Kokumbona. Division headquarters ordered the raiders to join forces with Colonel Puller's force to attack west the next day, 27 September. Colonel Edson was assigned to command the combined forces, with Puller as second in command. Edson ordered the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, to attack west across the river mouth, while the raiders moved upstream to cross the river at a stream junction about 2,000 yards from the mouth. Both battalions moved to the attack in the morning, but failed to gain ground. The 2nd Battalion was unable to establish itself on the west bank. The raiders, meanwhile, had advanced to the high ground, Hill 67 on the east bank, about 1,500 yards south of the beach, where they were halted by unexpected enemy fire. During the previous night, a Japanese force had crossed upstream to the east bank and occupied Hill 65, about 850 yards south of Hill 67. In the raiders' attempt to advance, Colonel Griffith was wounded, and Major Bailey, the battalion executive officer, was annihilated. Unable to move farther, the Raider Battalion sent a message to Colonel Edson to explain the situation, but in the haste and excitement of battle it was badly phrased. Colonel Edson concluded from the message that the raiders had crossed the river and were meeting resistance in the village of Matanikau itself. He decided on a new plan of attack, which was based on the erroneous assumption that the raiders had reached Matanikau. The raiders were to resume the advance at 13:30, while the 2nd Battalion, 5th, attacked across the river mouth. Colonel Puller's 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, was to embark in landing craft at Kokumbona, land west of Point Cruz, and attack the Japanese in Matanikau from the rear. The 1st Battalion, supported by fire from the destroyer Ballard, landed west of Point Cruz as ordered, and advanced toward the first ridge about 350 yards inland. No sooner had it gained the ridge than a Japanese force attacked it from both flanks and cut it off from the shore. The acting battalion commander was annihilated. Before the battalion could be withdrawn from its dangerous position, Division headquarters lost control of the situation. Just as the battalion was being surrounded, 26 Japanese bombers attacked the positions in the Lunga area, including the division command post. Resultant damage included the complete disruption of all communication facilities at the division headquarters at a time when reliable communication was imperative. The arrangements for withdrawal of the 1st Battalion were completed by Colonel Edson, while division headquarters re-established contact with Edson over the artillery telephone line to the forward observers. Fortunately, the Ballard, which had withdrawn during the air raid, had been notified of the 1st Battalion's plight. Colonel Puller, who was also aware of the situation, was taken aboard the destroyer, which sailed in close to the beach west of Point Cruz. Receiving firing data from a 1st Battalion sergeant using signal flags, the Ballard laid down a barrage. Puller ordered his battalion to fight its way to the beach at all costs. The battalion successfully cut through the enemy, reached the beach, and boarded landing craft which had come up from Lunga Point. All the wounded men were brought out safely, and by nightfall the battalion had returned to the Lunga perimeter. Once Puller's battalion was safe, the raiders and the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, also withdrew. In this hastily planned, unsuccessful action, the Marines lost 60 annihilated and 100 wounded. The next offensive came 10 days later. Its object was to establish a line far enough to the west to keep the Japanese beyond artillery range of Henderson Field. Information from higher headquarters, coast watchers, aerial reconnaissance, and ground patrols indicated that the Japanese were building up strength in the west in preparation for offensive action. Opposing patrols were clashing daily on the east bank of the Matanikau. Japanese 150mm guns capable of interdicting Henderson Field from Kokumbona were landed in late September. The 1st Marine Division therefore determined to trap and destroy the enemy near Point Cruz and drive any survivors west beyond the Poha River, about 9,000 yards west of Point Cruz. If this operation succeeded, a patrol base could be established at Kokumbona, and the airfield would be safe from artillery fire. The division's plan of attack called for the 5th Marines less 1 battalion to execute a holding attack at the mouth of the Matanikau River, crossing the river on divisional order, while the 7th Marines less 1 battalion and 1 reinforced battalion enveloped Point Cruz. The reinforced battalion, commanded by Colonel William J. Whaling, was composed of the 3D Battalion of the 2nd Marines and the Division Scout Sniper Detachment, a detachment which Colonel Whaling had personally trained on Guadalcanal in an effort to improve the quality of patrolling. The Whaling Group was to follow the 5th Marines along the coast road, then turn southwest and advance inland to a point about 2,000 yards southwest of the river mouth, where the Matanikau is narrow. The group was to cross the river on a bridge made of logs thrown across the stream and then turn right north to attack. The ridges west of the Matanikau, from 200 to 300 feet in height, run from north to south. The Whaling Group was to attack north along the first ridge west of the river. The 7th Marines less 1 Battalion was to follow the Whaling Group across the river, advance beyond the first ridge, and attack northward with battalions abreast on the left of the Whaling Group. If these attacks succeeded in reaching the beach and destroying the Japanese, the 5th Marines would pass through the Whaling Group and the 7th Marines to attack west toward Kokumbona. The 3D Battalion, 1st Marines, was in reserve. The 1st Marine Air Wing was to support the offensive with dive bombing and strafing. Officers of the attacking infantry forces were assigned as air-forward observers to radio target data to the supporting aircraft. The wing was also to provide liaison planes for the infantry and spotting planes for the artillery. The 1st Battalion, 11th Marines, was to provide direct artillery support to the 7th Marines, the 2nd Battalion to the 5th Marines, the 5th Battalion to the Whaling Group. The 3D Battalion was to cover the perimeter while the other 3 were engaged. The Japanese had also prepared a plan of attack, which was markedly similar to that of the Marines. In preparation for the counteroffensive against Lunga Point, the 1/7th Army and the 2nd Division had ordered the 4th Infantry, commanded by Colonel Tadamasu Nakaguma, to seize positions east of the Matanikau about 8th October for use by the artillery. The 1st Battalion of the 4th Infantry was to occupy the Point Cruz area and cross the Matanikau at its mouth, while the 3D Battalion made a crossing farther inland. Should the 4th Infantry's attack succeed, the Japanese would be able to deny to the Marines the Matanikau River, one of the best defense lines west of the Lunga. Fortunately, the Marines struck before the enemy could execute his entire plan. The attacking Marines passed through the perimeter defense line near Kokumbona at 7 o'clock, 7 October, en route to the line of departure on the Matanikau. About 10:05, the advance guard of the 3D Battalion of the 5th Marines, marching along the coast road, met enemy fire several hundred yards east of the river. The 3D Battalion deployed and forced the enemy slowly back toward the river, while the 2nd Battalion moved to the left around the 3D. Meeting no opposition, the 2nd Battalion reached the river by 11:48. The Whaling Group and the 7th Marines, having turned southwest in column, advanced about 3,000 yards toward Hill 65. They met light rifle fire but reached Hill 65 safely and bivouacked there for the night. Some Japanese had escaped over the river, but others had meanwhile halted part of the 3D Battalion, 5th Marines, just short of the east bank of the river, and retained a small bridgehead about 400 yards south of the river mouth. One company of the 1st Raider Battalion, then at about one-half its authorized strength, moved up to reinforce the 5th Marines' right flank. During the night of 7 to 8 October, the 5th Marines and the Raider Company held a 1,500-yard front extending inland from the river mouth, and bowed to the east around the Japanese bridgehead. The Whaling Group and the 7th Marines occupied bivouac areas on high ground, overlooking the river about 800 yards southeast of the 5th Marines' left flank. To divert the Japanese from the enveloping force, the 5th Marines noisily simulated preparations for an immediate river crossing. Amphibian tractors rumbled up and down the coastal area behind the lines to convince the Japanese that they were threatened by a tank attack across the river mouth. Otherwise, the night was uneventful. The attack across the river had originally been set for 8 October, but as heavy rains on that day turned the ground into mud, made the coral ridges slippery, and impeded air operations, the attack was postponed until the next day. The 5th Marines and the Raiders continued to reduce the Japanese bridgehead on the east bank. At 18 hours, some of the Japanese, climbing out of their standing-type foxholes, attempted to break out through the right of the line, which was lightly held. In mass formation, they struck against the Raiders' right flank. Running abreast, the front ranks fired small arms while the rear ranks threw grenades over the heads of the first rank. In the gathering dusk, a sharp hand-to-hand fight ensued between the Japanese and a small group of raiders. Casualties on both sides were heavy. Some of the surviving Japanese broke out, but were trapped and annihilated against the barbed wire barricade which the Marines had erected over the sandbar. Elsewhere, the night of 8 to 9 October was quiet, except for intermittent rifle and machine gun fire. At this point, the nature of the offensive had to be changed. Division headquarters, warned on 8 October that the impending Japanese counteroffensive would employ strong reinforcements, cancelled its plans to attack toward Kokumbona and the Poha and turned the operation into a large-scale raid against the Point Cruz area. With the enemy threatening to attack in strength, it was necessary to hold the Lunga perimeter with all available forces, then amounting to 19,000 men. To send troops more than one day's march from the Lunga perimeter involved a greater risk than General Vandergrift felt was feasible. By 9 October, the remaining Japanese east of the Matanikau had been annihilated. The weather had cleared, the troops were rested. The Whaling Group, followed by the 7th Marines, left its bivouac, crossed the Matanikau, climbed the first ridge, and rapidly attacked north along hills 73 and 75 to the coastal area. The 2nd Battalion of the 7th Marines, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel H. Hanneken, advanced about 800 yards west of the river and turned right to attack over Hill 72 to Point Cruz. Hanneken's battalion met only light enemy fire. Colonel Puller's 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, advanced about 1,200 yards beyond the Matanikau and attacked north along a 2,000-yard ridge, Hills 668180. The 1st Battalion met stronger Japanese resistance. One group of Japanese held positions in a deep ravine on the 1st Battalion's left between Hills 81 to 80 and the hill mass on the west, Hill 83. Calling on the 11th Marines for artillery fire to cover his front, the battalion commander directed the battalion mortars to fire into the ravine. When their positions were hit by this mortar fire, the Japanese attempted to escape from the ravine by climbing the steep, open eastern slopes of Hill 83, where they were easy targets for rifle and machine gun fire. Some returned to the ravine, which was still under mortar fire. When his mortar ammunition ran out, Colonel Puller withdrew his battalion according to instructions, and by 14 o'clock, the whole enveloping force, the Whaling Group, and the 2nd and 1st Battalions of the 7th Marines had crossed east over the mouth of the Matanikau to return to Lunga Point. The withdrawal was covered by the 5th Marines. The 11th Marines had fired 2,188 75mm rounds and 1,063 105mm rounds in support of the three-day operation. A Marine patrol later found a Japanese officer's diary, which indicated that the 4th Infantry had lost nearly 700 men during the 3 days. The Marines lost 65 annihilated, 125 wounded. Thus far during the campaign, the ground engagements that had been fought were hot, sharp actions involving relatively small forces, but the Japanese were preparing for a much larger operation. The Japanese, who had been planning for a full-scale counteroffensive ever since August, had completed their preparations by October and were ready to strike. The first attempts by the inadequate Ichiki and Kawaguchi forces had failed to dislodge the Marines from their defenses around the airfield. The early Japanese estimates of American strength had proved to be disastrously low. Major General Shuicho Miyazaki wrote later that, while in Tokyo prior to becoming Chief of Staff of the 17th Army, he had lacked exact knowledge of American strength. Does the American force which landed on Guadalcanal on August 7th, he had asked himself, represent the entire enemy force committed to this campaign, or is it only the spearhead of a large counter-offensive? If it is the former, our operations will most certainly be successful. But if it is the latter, victory or defeat hangs in the balance. When the Japanese planned their operation in the spring of 1942, Miyazaki wrote, they hoped to sever the line of communications between the United States and Australia with 2 separate thrusts. One had as its goal Port Moresby in New Guinea, while the other, an advance through the Solomons, was aimed at the Fijis, Samoa, and New Caledonia. The Allied offensive in August, however, had turned these 2 thrusts into a single campaign. Operations against Port Moresby, which had been repulsed in May at the Battle of the Coral Sea, had meanwhile been resumed by one small force moving overland across the Papuan Peninsula of New Guinea. After August, 7th Army headquarters at Rabaul raised its estimates of American strength on Guadalcanal, but still made serious miscalculations. It believed that 7,500 American troops were holding Lunga Point on 19 September. Actually, United States strength on Guadalcanal at the end of September was above 19,000 and rose to over 23,000 on 13 October. On the basis of erroneous estimates, General Hyakutake had been preparing elaborate plans for the recapture of Lunga Point even before the Kawaguchi force had reached Guadalcanal. The first plan, issued on 28 August and altered several times afterward, established the basic concept for the Japanese counteroffensive which was to begin in October. General Hyakutake intended to command the operation on Guadalcanal personally. The Kawaguchi force was to secure positions east and west of the Matanikau to cover a projected landing by a fresh division, to secure a line of departure, and to harass the Lunga defences while a strong artillery force prepared to neutralise Henderson Field. The 7th Army was to arrange for the transport of the necessary troops from Rabaul. Once the troops reached Guadalcanal and completed their preparations for the attack, they were to capture the enemy positions, especially the airfield and artillery positions, in one blow. General Hyakutake also considered sending one force in an amphibious attack behind the enemy. The operation to surround and recapture Guadalcanal, he grandiloquently announced, will truly decide the fate of the control of the entire Pacific area. Once Lunga Point was retaken, the Japanese planned to seize Renal, Tulagi, and San Cristobal. During this phase, 1/7th Army Reserve Forces and the Imperial Navy were to intensify the attacks against General MacArthur's force in New Guinea. Port Moresby was to be taken by the end of November. Because the importance of Guadalcanal prevented planes, warships and troop transports from being sent from the Solomons to New Guinea, the Japanese were forced to finish the Guadalcanal campaign before attempting to reinforce New Guinea. The Japanese offensive against Guadalcanal was to be a joint operation. In September, 1/7th Army representatives met at Truk with the commanders of the Combined and the Southeastern Fleets to plan the attack, which was tentatively set for 21st October. Japanese warships were to cooperate fully until 2 weeks after the fresh division had landed. Drawing troops for the projected operation from China, the East Indies, the Philippines, and Truk on orders from Imperial General Headquarters, the Japanese assembled, by October, a strong force in Rabaul and the Solomons under the 1/7th Army's command. The infantry units consisted of 2 divisions, 1 brigade, and 1 reinforced battalion. Supporting them were 3 independent anti-aircraft artillery battalions, 3 field anti-aircraft artillery battalions, 1 field anti-aircraft artillery battery, 1 heavy field artillery regiment, plus extra batteries, 1 tank regiment and 1 tank company, 1 independent mountain artillery regiment, and 1 independent mountain artillery battalion, 1 engineer regiment, 1 trench mortar battalion, and a reconnaissance plane unit. Of these, the brigade and the reinforced battalion of Kawaguchi and Ichiki forces and additional battalions of the 4th Infantry had already met defeat on Guadalcanal. The 2nd and 38th Divisions, forming the bulk of the main infantry force which had been assembled, had formerly belonged to the 16th Army. In March 1942, the 2nd Division, which had been recruited in Sendai in the Miyagi prefecture of Honshu, had moved from Manchuria to Java as a garrison force. In July 1942, the 4th Infantry was detached for service in the Philippines, while the 16th and 29th Regiments remained in Java. In August 1942, the entire division was transferred to Rabaul and the Shortland Islands. The 38th Division had been organized in September 1939 inches Nagoya in the Aichi prefecture of Honshu. A triangular division, it consisted of the 228th, 229th, and 230th Infantry Regiments. In 1941, it took part in the siege of Hong Kong, after which its regiments were detached. 1 detachment, the reinforced 228th Infantry under Major General Takeo Ito, assisted in the capture of Amboina and Timor. 1 battalion of the 229th Infantry also helped to take Timor, while the remainder of the regiment campaigned in Sumatra. The 230th Infantry had served in the Java campaign. The division then reassembled at Rabaul in late September 1942. The 4th Heavy Field Artillery Regiment, comprising 150mm howitzers, was dispatched from China in September 1942, arriving at Rabaul in early October. Although the 1/7th Army was composed of veteran regiments, it had seldom operated as one unit. Likewise, the infantry divisions had seldom seen action as divisions. Individual regiments and battalions had campaigned actively, but had never fought against a foe who possessed superior numbers, equipment, or strong defensive positions. The movement of Japanese forces from Rabaul and the Northern Solomons to Guadalcanal, already begun in August, increased rapidly during September and October. By destroyer, by landing craft, by cargo ship and transport, the enemy soldiers sailed down the inter-island channels to land on the beaches west of the Matanikau River under cover of darkness, while destroyers covered the landings by bombarding Lunga Point. The Allied forces which might have opposed them were too few in number to be risked in action north of Guadalcanal, and at night the darkness and clouds helped to hide the Japanese ships from Henderson Field aircraft. By mid-October, General Hyakutake had assembled a sizable portion of his army, except the main body of the 38th Division, on Guadalcanal. The 2nd Division and 2 battalions of the 38th Division were ready to fight beside the survivors of the Ichiki and Kawaguchi forces. In addition, there were present 1 regiment and 3 batteries of heavy field artillery, 2 battalions and 1 battery of field anti-aircraft artillery, 1 battalion and 1 battery of mountain artillery, 1 mortar battalion, 1 tank company, and 3 rapid-fire gun battalions. Engineer, transport and medical troops, and a few special naval landing force troops were also on the island. These forces, about 20,000 men, though below full strength, represented the largest concentration of Japanese troops on Guadalcanal up to that time. The Americans on Guadalcanal thus faced a serious enemy threat. Yet as late as 5 October South Pacific Headquarters had not definitely decided to send additional reinforcements to the 1st Marine Division. Though deferred, the plans for occupying Endeni and the Santa Cruz Islands had not been cancelled. The purpose of holding Endeni, 335 nautical miles east-southeast of Henderson Field and about 300 nautical miles north-northwest of Espiritu Santo, was threefold: to deny it to the Japanese, to protect the right flank of the Allied line of communications to Guadalcanal, and to provide an intermediate airfield for short-range aircraft to stage through while en route from Espiritu Santo to Guadalcanal. Admiral Nimitz had recommended early in September that Endeni be occupied sometime later at a date to be determined by Admiral Gormley. Dispatches between Admirals King and Gormley in late September discussed the possibility of using the 8th Marines of the 2nd Marine Division for the Santa Cruz operation. On 29 September, Admiral Gormley announced that he was planning to occupy Endeni with a part of that regiment, which was then in need of more training. On the same day, he rejected Admiral Turner's suggestion that 1 battalion of the 2nd Marines be withdrawn from the Guadalcanal Tulagi area for Endeni. Admiral Turner then suggested transporting 1 Army Infantry Battalion, some Army Field Artillery, a detachment of the 5th Marine Defence Battalion, and naval construction forces to Endeni in 2 transports and 1 cargo ship. These forces were to be followed by a 2nd Army Infantry Battalion, 1 Army Anti-Aircraft Artillery Regiment, and 1 Army Coast Artillery Battery, transported in 5 ships. General Harmon, the Army commander in the South Pacific, regarded the entire Endeni project as unsound and unnecessary. When Admiral Gormley tentatively agreed to Admiral Turner's proposal, General Harmon, in a letter to Admiral Gormley dated 6 October 1942, reviewed the reasons for the Endeni operation in the light of the situation on Guadalcanal. Endeni, he wrote, would yield sparse results for 2 or 3 months, and was not vital to the security of the South Pacific. As long as Allied forces could operate from Espiritu Santo, the Japanese could not operate in strength from Endeni. Since nearly all Allied aircraft could fly directly from Espiritu Santo to Guadalcanal, Endeni was not needed as a staging base. Occupation of Endeni, General Harmon pointed out, would divert strength from the main effort. The situation on Guadalcanal was exceedingly grave, for if the Japanese were to use artillery against the airfield, they could cause serious damage. If the beachhead on Guadalcanal fell, then the Endeni operation would be a complete waste. The main effort must be in the Solomons. If the beachhead on Guadalcanal did not hold, the Japanese would have an outpost to protect the Bismarcks and to cover New Guinea, as well as a point of departure for advances to the south. It is my personal conviction, he wrote, that the Japan is capable of retaking Cactus Ringbolt, Guadalcanal Tulagi, and that he will do so in the near future, unless it is materially strengthened. But if Guadalcanal was strengthened, the airfield improved for heavy bombers, and naval surface operations intensified, the enemy would not make the costly attempt to retake Lunga Point. General Harmon therefore recommended 1. That the Endeni operation be deferred until the southern Solomons were secure. 2. That Guadalcanal be reinforced by at least 1 more regimental combat team. 3. That naval surface operations in the Solomons be increased. And 4. That sufficient airdrome construction personnel and equipment be sent to Guadalcanal. What was needed at Henderson Field, he stated, was 2 all-weather runways, improved dispersal facilities and fueling systems, a standing fuel supply of at least 250,000 gallons, and intensive air operations from Guadalcanal against the Northern Solomons. After Admiral Gormley received this letter, he conferred with Admiral Turner and General Harmon on the evening of 6 October. After the conference, Admiral Gormley announced his intention to proceed with the plan to occupy Endeni and build a landing strip, as it seemed likely that the Japanese would try to recapture the Lunga airfield. He accepted General Harmon's recommendations that Guadalcanal be reinforced by 1 Army regiment, and that the island's airdrome facilities be improved. Reinforcements would prove valuable, for General Vandergrift could then safely enlarge the defence perimeter around Henderson Field to protect it from enemy fire. Although casualties from enemy action had not been prohibitive by 18 September 848 wounded had been evacuated, the 1st Marine Division was beginning to suffer heavily from tropical diseases. The enervating, humid heat, skin infections caused by fungi, and inadequate diet had weakened the troops. A mild form of gastroenteritis had appeared in August. Although it caused only 1 death, this disorder made many temporarily unfit for duty and lowered their resistance to other diseases. During the 3rd week in August, malaria had first appeared among the troops. Suppressive atabrine treatment had been inaugurated on 10 September, but the disease had gained such a foothold that it was to become the most serious medical problem of the campaign. It sent 1,960 men of the division into the hospital during October. The force selected for the reinforcement of Guadalcanal was the 164th Infantry Regiment of the American Division, which was then in New Caledonia. The regiment was immediately alerted for movement and began loading the Zalin and the Macaulay, the flagship of the South Pacific Amphibious Force, at 8 o'clock, 8 October, at Noumea. The 147th Infantry less 2 battalions, Colonel W.B. Tuttle commanding, which was then at Tongatabu, was selected for Denis. The Macaulay and Zalin, loaded on 8 October, sailed from Noumea the next morning with the troops, weapons and supplies of the 164th Infantry, 210 men of the 1st Marine Air Wing, 85 Marine casuals, and cargo for the 1st Marine Division. 3 destroyers and 3 mine layers escorted the transports, while 4 cruisers and 5 destroyers under Rear Admiral Norman Scott covered their left flank. The Macaulay and the Zalin sailed safely from Noumea to Guadalcanal and arrived off Lunga Point to discharge troops and cargo at 5:47 amperes. 13 October. Though interrupted twice during the day by Japanese bombing raids, the ships landed 2,852 men of the 164th Infantry, 210 of the 1st Marine Air Wing, and 85 casuals, plus 44 quarter-ton trucks, jeeps, 20 half-ton trucks, 17 1.5-ton trucks, 16 British Bren gun carriers, 12 37mm guns, 5 units of fire, 70 days rations, 60 days supplies, complete tentage, and 1,000 ships' tons of cargo for the 1st Marine Division and the naval units. The 164th Infantry supplies, which were landed, totaled over 3,200 ships' tons. The Macaulay and Zalin, completely unloaded, embarked the 1st Raider Battalion and sailed out of Sealark Channel before nightfall to return to Noumea. The first naval craft to be permanently based at Tulagi, aside from harbour patrol boats, were 4 boats of Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3, which the destroyers Southard and Hovey had towed in on 12 October. The Jamestown, arriving at Tulagi on 22 October, stayed there as a service ship for the Torpedo Boat Squadron, which was brought to full strength on 25 October by the arrival of 4 more boats. Before the Japanese counteroffensive in late October, therefore, the 1st Marine Division had been materially strengthened. With these reinforcements, troop strength on Guadalcanal and Tulagi totaled 27,727 of all services. 23,088 men were on Guadalcanal, the remainder on Tulagi. When Admiral Gormley ordered the 164th Infantry to Guadalcanal, General Vandegrift decided to establish permanent positions on the east bank of the Matanikau River, occupied in the offensive of 7 to 9 October. Domination of the mouth of the Matanikau was essential to the defence of Henderson Field. The rough terrain and thick jungles on the Matanikau effectively prevented heavy equipment from crossing the unbridged river at any point except over the sandbar at the mouth. Since tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces could cross the river over the bar, the Japanese, had they been able to dominate the position, could have put their tanks across it to deploy for attack against the perimeter defence. Had they been able to emplace artillery on the east bank, they might have damaged the Lunga positions and the airfield even more heavily than they did in October. 2 infantry battalions and elements of the 1st Special Weapons Battalion were assigned to hold the Matanikau. They established a horseshoe-shaped position, running from the mouth along the east bank to a point about 2,000 yards inland. They refused the right flank along the beach and the left flank east, along the ridgeline of Hill 67, a strong defensive position. The Marines cleared fields of fire, rigged booby traps, and laid personnel and anti-tank mines in front. Several 37mm anti-tank guns, with 75mm tank destroyers concealed nearby in support, covered the sandbar, which was illuminated at night by headlights salvaged from damaged amphibian tractors. There were not enough troops to hold the beach and jungle between the forward Matanikau position and the perimeter defence. Patrols covered the gaps each day. The arrival of the 164th Infantry on 13 October permitted General Vandegrift to make further changes in the Lunga perimeter defence. The 22,000-yard-long perimeter line was divided into 5 regimental sectors. As it was believed that the enemy would be most likely to attack from the west, the heaviest strength was concentrated in the western sectors. In Sector 1, 7,100 yards of beach on Lunga Point, the 3D Defence Battalion, with the 1st Special Weapons Battalion attached, had tactical command, and coordinated the related functions of beach defence and anti-aircraft fire. The amphibian tractor, engineer, and pioneer troops continued to hold the beach lines at night. The 164th Infantry, Colonel Bryant E. Moore commanding, and elements of the 1st Special Weapons Battalion were assigned to Sector 2, the longest infantry sector. This 6,600-yard line extended along the beach from the 3D Defence Battalion's right flank to the Ilu River, inland along the Ilu about 4,000 yards, and west through the jungle to the left flank of the 7th Marines. The 7th Marines less 1 Battalion occupied Sector 3, about 2,500 yards of jungle between the 164th Infantry's right and the Lunga River, including the south slopes of Vicious Ridge. The 1st Marines less 1 Battalion held Sector 4, about 3,500 yards of jungle between the Lunga and the left flank of the 5th Marines, who held Sector 5, the western corner of the perimeter. The 3D battalions of both the 1st and 7th Marines held the Matanikau line, and were supported by parts of the 1st Special Weapons Battalion and 1 battalion of the 11th Marines. The 1st Air Wing was to continue to provide air cover, close ground support, and longer-range bombardment and reconnaissance. The 1st Tank Battalion, then held in Division Reserve, was to continue to reconnoitre areas suitable for tank action. Each sector was placed under the command of the respective regimental commander. Division headquarters again directed each sector commander to maintain 1 battalion in reserve to be available to the division if needed. These were the defences with which the Lunga garrison was to meet the Japanese counteroffensive in October. While the 1/7th Army troops had been landing on Guadalcanal's north coast, Japanese fleet units had been preparing to execute their part of the plan. The strongest Japanese naval force assembled since the Battle of Midway left Truk to assemble at Rabaul for the offensive. Bombers from the southwest Pacific had been attacking Rabaul regularly, but they had inflicted little damage and presented no great threat to the assembling fleet. Japanese submarines had deployed southward in August and September to try to cut the American supply lines leading to Guadalcanal, and warships escorted 1/7th Army convoys to Guadalcanal and shelled the airfield almost every night. As long as American aircraft could operate from Henderson Field, the Japanese could not safely bring troops and heavy equipment to Guadalcanal in transports and cargo ships. The nocturnal Tokyo Express could deliver troops in relative safety, but could not carry heavy equipment or large amounts of supplies. The Tokyo Express warships and the daylight bombers therefore made a concerted effort in October to neutralize the Lunga airfield. Admiral Gormley's naval forces were still smaller than those that the Japanese could muster, but, determined to stop the nightly naval bombardments and the flow of enemy reinforcements to Guadalcanal, he ordered the 4 cruisers and 5 destroyers under Admiral Scott to sail from Espiritu Santo to Savo by way of Renal to intercept any Japanese naval units moving on Guadalcanal. Scott's force was also to cover the left flank of the convoy carrying the 164th Infantry to Guadalcanal. At 13:45, 11 October, patrol planes from Guadalcanal discovered a Japanese force of 4 cruisers and 1 destroyer sailing south through the slot toward Guadalcanal. The Japanese had dispatched them to neutralize Henderson Field and thus provide greater safety for the landing of additional troops and supplies. The force was sighted again at 1810, about 110 miles from Guadalcanal. Informed of the approaching Japanese, Admiral Scott sailed from the vicinity of Renel toward Cape Esperance to be in position to stop them about midnight. As Scott's force neared the channel between Cape Esperance and Savo, about 22:32, the screens of the radars on the cruisers Boise and Helena showed 5 Japanese ships 18,000 yards to the northwest. Search planes from the cruiser San Francisco also reported about 23 that 1 Japanese transport and 2 destroyers were in Sea Lark Channel, but Scott decided to attack the larger force of cruisers and destroyers. The transport and the 2 destroyers escaped. The Boise and Helena reported the presence of the Japanese cruisers and destroyers by voice radio to Admiral Scott aboard the San Francisco, but he did not attack at once. The flagship's radar was older and less efficient than that aboard the other cruisers, and Scott was not sure of the location of the destroyers of his force. He feared that the destroyers reported by the Boise and Helena might be his own. The American destroyers, having recently changed their course, were then to starboard north of Scott's cruisers, which were sailing on a southwesterly course. The American destroyers thus lay between the opposing cruiser forces. The Helena opened fire on the Japanese at 23:46, 11 October. Her fire was followed by that of the cruiser Salt Lake City, the Boise, and the destroyer Fahrenhold. The Japanese were caught completely by surprise. The American column executed the classic naval maneuver of crossing the enemy's T by sailing in column at a right angle to and ahead of the approaching Japanese column. The entire American force was thus able to concentrate salvos on each ship as it came forward. Each Japanese ship, on the other hand, masked the guns of the ships in its rear. 2 Japanese vessels sank at once. The flagship Aoba was badly damaged, and the cruiser Kinugasa suffered light damage. The surviving Japanese ships retired northward after 34 minutes of battle. The destroyer Marukamo was joined by the destroyer Natsugumo, and they returned to Savo to rescue survivors in the water, but both were sunk the next morning by dive bombers and fighters from Henderson Field. Scott's losses were light by comparison. The Boise, Salt Lake City, and Fahrenholtz suffered damage. The destroyer Duncan, which had pulled close to fire torpedoes at the enemy, was caught between the American and Japanese forces, hit by fire from both, and sank on 12 October. The victory at Cape Esperance, whose flames lit the night skies west of the Lunga, cheered the men in the Lunga perimeter, but its effects were short-lived. 2 days after Admiral Scott's force stopped the Tokyo Express, the Japanese hit the airfield with damaging blows. Guadalcanal's air situation had steadily improved during September, for more planes had been arriving. On 22 September, Vandegrift reported to Gormley that 30 F-4Fs, 22 SBDs, 7 TBFs, and 5 P-400s were operational. The naval advanced base at Kukum included an aviation unit and the 6th Construction Battalion. Air Squadron personnel totaled 1,014,917 men of Marine Air Group 2333 of the 6th 7th Fighter Squadron, and 64 from the Naval Carrier Squadron. The P-400s had proved so valuable that Vandegrift requested more to support ground operations. By 10 October 12, P-39s of the 6th 7th Fighter Squadron had reached Henderson Field, but had not yet gone into action. B-17s were now occasionally being staged through Henderson Field, but these operations were soon to end. On 13 October, there were 90 operational aircraft under General Geiger's command at Henderson Field, 39 SBDs, 41 F-4Fs, 4 P-400s, and 6 P-39s. At 12 o'clock, 22 Japanese bombers, escorted by fighters, flew over to bomb Henderson Field from 30,000 feet. They were almost unchallenged. The Pagos could reach only 12,000 feet. The P-39s could climb to 27,000. The F-4F, a relatively slow climber, could not reach the enemy in time to intercept him. Between 13:30 and 14, all the American planes were forced to land for more gasoline. While they were being refueled, a second wave of about 15 bombers attacked the field. The men of the 6th Construction Battalion worked throughout the afternoon in an effort to keep the field in operation. They had loaded their dump trucks with earth well in advance to speed the task of filling the bomb craters, but their efforts did not avail. The Japanese did not completely neutralize the runway on 13 October, but they inflicted such severe damage that General Geiger was forced to broadcast the information that Henderson Field could not be used by heavy bombers except in emergencies. After the last bomber had retired, the long-range 150mm howitzers which the Japanese had been landing opened fire on the airfield and Kukum Beach from positions near Kokumbona. They first made Kukum Beach untenable. The 1st Marine Division had no sound and flash units to locate the enemy howitzers, or suitable counter-battery artillery with which to reply to Pistol Pete, as the troops called the enemy artillery. The field artillery units were armed with 75mm pack and 105mm howitzers, and the 3D Defence Battalion had emplaced its 5-inch gun batteries on the beach. On 13 October, and the days that followed, the 5-inch guns and the 105mm howitzers attempted to silence Pistol Pete. But the trajectory of the 5-inch guns was too flat for effective counter-battery fire. Some of the 105 seconds were moved up to the Matanikau River, but they were too light for effective counter-battery fire. Aircraft also attempted to silence the Japanese artillery, but were no more successful than the artillery. Shortly before midnight of 13 October, a Japanese naval force which included the battleships Haruna and Congo sailed unchallenged into Sealark Channel. While a cruiser plane illuminated the target area by dropping flares, the task force bombarded the airfield for 80 minutes, the heaviest shelling of the campaign. The battleships fired 918 rounds of 360mm ammunition, of which 625 were armor-piercing and 293 high-explosive. They covered the field systematically. Explosions and burning gasoline lit the night brightly. In the words of a Japanese report, explosions were seen everywhere, and the entire airfield was a sea of flame. 41 men were annihilated, and many aircraft damaged. When the shelling had ceased, enemy bombers raided the airfield intermittently until daylight. On 14 October, only 42 planes would fly 7 SBDs, 29 F-4Fs, 4 P-400s, and 2 P-39s. An American report states, "When the men could finally come from their foxholes and survey the damage, they knew what had hit them. They found jagged noses of shells measuring 14 inches in diameter, the shells from battleships' guns and smaller pieces of shrapnel. Bits of clothing and equipment were hanging from telephone wires. The field itself was in shambles. The 6th 7th Fighter Squadron was fortunate. Only 2 P-39s were damaged, and miraculously, not one of the old P-400s was hit. The next morning, a few B-17s, which had been operating temporarily from Henderson Field, took off safely from the 2,000 feet of usable runway to return to Espiritu Santo. The bombardments had rendered the airfield unusable as a base for heavy bombers. Moreover, the presence of Japanese aircraft and warships over and in Sealark Channel prevented cargo ships from bringing in fuel, so that the perpetual shortage of aviation gasoline on Guadalcanal had now become more acute. As a result, B-17s could no longer be staged through Henderson Field. By the afternoon of 14 October, Japanese bombing and shelling had knocked Henderson Field out of action. Pistol Pete prevented aircraft from using the runway. Fortunately, the construction battalion had laid out a rough, grassy runway southeast of Henderson Field. When dry, this runway, Fighter Strip No. 1, could be used by light planes, and it served for a week as the main airfield. Aviation gasoline supplies had fallen to a critically low level. On the afternoon of 14 October, a Marine staff officer informed the 6th 7th Fighter Squadron that there remained just enough gasoline to mount strikes against a Japanese force, including transports, which patrolling SBDs had found sailing toward Guadalcanal. The 6th 7th was ordered to load its planes with 100-pound bombs and to join the SBDs in striking at the oncoming ships. The aircraft took off and located the enemy before nightfall. They sank one ship and set another on fire, but failed to halt the convoy, which continued on toward Guadalcanal under cover of darkness. When day broke on 15 October, 5 Japanese transports and their 11 escorting warships were plainly visible from Lunga Point as they lay 10 miles away at Tassafaronga, unloading troops, weapons, supplies, and ammunition. The runway was pitted with shell and bomb craters. Only by searching wrecked planes and hunting in the jungles beside the runway for stray gasoline drums was enough fuel obtained for the planes to take off from the pitted runway to strike at the ships. The searches had yielded 400 drums, or about enough for 2 days' operations. On the same day, Army and Marine Corps transport planes C-47s began flying gasoline from Espiritu Santo to Guadalcanal, despite the fire from Pistol Pete. Each C-47 carried 12 drums. The seaplane tender McFarland also ran in a load of gasoline from Espiritu Santo. Caught by Japanese planes in Sealark Channel on 16 October, she was seriously damaged but was salvaged by her crew in an inlet on Florida Island. American fighters and dive bombers attacked the Japanese ships on 15 October, and despite anti-aircraft fire and the opposition of Japanese planes, sank one transport and set 2 more afire by 11 o'clock. The remaining ships and their escorts, under attack from both Guadalcanal aircraft and B-17s and SBDs from Espiritu, then put out to sea. One ship fell victim to the B-17s near Savo. Although the air attacks seriously damaged the Japanese transports, they succeeded in landing all the troops between 3,000 and 4,000 men and 80% of their cargo. The soldiers included part of the 230th Infantry of the 38th Division, as well as 7 companies of the 16th Infantry of the 2nd Division, the last Japanese infantry units to land prior to the opening of the ground offensive against Lunga perimeter. That the Japanese were preparing to attack in force was all too obvious. General Vandergrift radioed to South Pacific headquarters to stress his need for the greatest possible amount of air and surface support. Admiral Gormley, fully aware of the situation, requested General MacArthur to have Southwest Pacific aircraft search the western approaches to the southern Solomons for enemy aircraft carriers. When the B-17s were forced off Henderson Field, Rear Admiral Aubrey W. Fitch, commanding South Pacific land-based aircraft, suggested that Southwest Pacific aircraft relieve the pressure on Guadalcanal by intensifying their attacks on Rabaul, Kahili, and Buka. On 16 October, Admiral Gormley warned Admiral Nimitz that the Japanese effort appeared to be all out. South Pacific forces, he stated, were totally inadequate and needed air reinforcements. Naval strength had been seriously weakened by combat losses. The Enterprise, Saratoga, and North Carolina were in Pearl Harbor undergoing repairs. Admiral Nimitz ordered that work on the Enterprise be rushed, and on 16 October, the veteran carrier was able to leave Pearl Harbor for the South Pacific with the South Dakota and 9 destroyers. Meanwhile, Fitch's force at Espiritu Santo was increased to 85 patrol planes and heavy bombers. Southwest Pacific aircraft continued to support Guadalcanal by patrolling and by bombing Rabaul and the fields in the northern Solomons. General Hyakutake's units had meanwhile been confidently preparing to execute their part of the plan an attack directed at the seizure of the airfield. The 1/7th Army issued tactical orders to the 2nd Division on 15 October. The main body of the 2nd Division, then in the vicinity of Kokumbona, was to deliver a surprise attack against the south flank of the American position on X Day, then tentatively set for 18 October, while the main body of the 2nd Division, commanded by Lieutenant General Masao Maruyama, was pushing inland to reach its line of departure south of the airfield. A force west of the Matanikau under command of Major General Tadashi Sumiyoshi, commander of 1/7th Army Artillery, was to cover its rear, divert the Americans, and shell the Lunga airfields and artillery positions. An amphibious attack by the 1st Battalion, 228th Infantry, was still a part of the plan, but it was later discarded. American morale and strength, the Japanese believed, were declining. The coast force under Sumiyoshi's command consisted of 5 infantry battalions of about 2,900 men, 1 tank company, 15 150mm howitzers, 3 100mm guns, and 7 field artillery pieces. The units in Sumiyoshi's force included the 4th Infantry, as well as elements of the 4th, 7th, and 2 1st Heavy Field Artillery Regiments, and several mountain artillery and anti-aircraft artillery units, and perhaps tanks and part of the 124th Infantry. The enveloping force under Maruyama, which was to attack Henderson Field from the south, consisted of 8 or 9 infantry battalions totaling 5,600 men, plus artillery, engineer, and medical troops. This force was divided into 2 wings. The right wing, under Kawaguchi, consisted of 1 battalion of the 124th Infantry, 2 battalions of the 230th Infantry, parts of the 3D Light Trench Mortar Battalion, and the 6th and 9th Independent Rapid Fire Gun Battalions, the 20th Independent Mountain Artillery, and engineers and medical troops. The left wing, under Major General Yumio Nasu, was composed of the 29th Infantry, the 3D Light Trench Mortar Battalion less detachments, a Rapid Fire Gun Battalion, a Mountain Artillery Battalion, and engineers. In reserve were the 16th Infantry and additional engineer units. Kawaguchi's wing, after working inland from Kokumbona, was to attack northward under cover of darkness from east of the Lunga to capture the airfield and destroy the American forces east of the Lunga. Nasu's left wing was to attack northward from a point between Kawaguchi and the Lunga River. Supremely confident that these soldiers could retake Lunga Point, General Hyakutake left the main body of the 38th Division at Rabaul and in the northern Solomons in readiness for operations in New Guinea. Capture of the field would be heralded by the code signal Banzai. He directed his troops to continue annihilating the enemy until General Vandergrift, with staff officers, interpreters, 1 American flag and 1 white flag, had advanced along the coast toward the Matanikau to surrender. To get troops, guns, ammunition, and supplies into position for the attack, the engineers built and improved roads leading from the landing beaches eastward to Kokumbona. Engineers and combat troops had also begun work in September on an inland trail by which the 2nd Division could get into position south of Henderson Field. This trail, commonly known as the Maruyama Trail, ran southward from the 1/7th Army Assembly Area at Kokumbona, then turned east to cross the Matanikau and Lunga rivers south of Mount Austin, and followed the Lunga River downstream north to a point near the American perimeter. It covered a distance of about 15 miles. The Maruyama Trail led through the thickest of tropical jungles, where giant hardwood trees, vines, and undergrowth are so thick that a man cannot easily walk upright or see more than a few yards. The route south of Mount Austin led over an almost unbelievably tangled series of ridges and ravines. As sunlight never penetrates the treetops, the earth underfoot is wet and swampy. The Japanese had no heavy road-building equipment but hacked their way by hand, using axes, saws, and machetes. At best, they could have cleared only a path through the undergrowth, making no attempt to cut down the trees. Mount Austin's bulk, plus the jungle, would hide the advancing column from Lunga Point, and the overhead growth provided security from aerial reconnaissance. Since the Japanese had brought no horses and almost no motor transport on the Tokyo Express, supplies had to be brought forward by hand from as far away as Cape Esperance. About 800 tons of supplies had to be hand-carried forward. The artillery pieces assigned to Maruyama were hauled forward by manpower. General Maruyama also ordered each soldier to carry, in addition to his regular equipment, 1 shell, apparently from the supply dump near Kokumbona. On 16 October, after assembling at Kokumbona, Maruyama's troops set out on their grueling march toward the line of departure east of the Lunga River, crossing mountains and rivers with much difficulty due to the bad roads and heavy terrain. Progress was slow. Since the trail was narrow, the men marched, single file, in a long, straggling column. The The van would begin the march early each morning, but the rear elements usually could not move until afternoon, with the result that the 2nd Division inched along like a worm. Torrential rains fell during most of the march. The troops, subsisting on half rations of raw rice, burdened with shells and full combat equipment, had to use ropes to scale some of the cliffs. They also used ropes to pull the artillery pieces, machine guns and mortars along the trail. As carrying and hauling the artillery pieces by manpower proved impossible, these guns were abandoned along the line of march. Hyakutake's confidence was somewhat justified, for he enjoyed significant advantages. The 150mm howitzers in Kokumbona outweighed the heaviest American howitzers on Guadalcanal. Almost nightly, Japanese warships were sailing into Sealark Channel with impunity. The majority of the 20,000 Japanese troops were fresh, while many of General Vandegrift's 23,000 men were suffering from malaria and malnutrition. The Japanese could reasonably expect to surprise the Americans, since the wide envelopment by Maruyama's division through jungled, mountainous terrain was hidden from ground or aerial observation. On the other hand, the Americans were entrenched in prepared positions, were expecting an attack, and could place artillery fire in front of any threatened sector of the perimeter. The Japanese had no nearby airfields, and American planes, though few in number, possessed local control of the air when they had enough gasoline, and thus limited the amount of heavy material which the enemy could safely land. The Japanese lacked sufficient transport. Hyakutake had committed his main force to a wide enveloping march through wild, trackless jungle, with all the difficulties of communication, coordination, and control attendant upon such a maneuver. Finally, it is doubtful that Hyakutake had enough reserves immediately available to exploit a breakthrough, even if the attack forces were able to penetrate the perimeter defense in strength. The landing of the Japanese from transports on 15 October had alerted the 1st Marine Division to a major attack by infantry. A captured map indicated the possibility of a triple-pronged attack by 3 enemy divisions from the east, west, and south, but there were no indications that fresh Japanese forces had landed east of the perimeter. Air and ground patrols had not found any organized bodies of Japanese troops along the upper Lunga, but only dispirited groups of hungry stragglers, most of whom were promptly annihilated. On the other hand, the increasing artillery fire and growing Japanese troop strength west of the Matanikau convinced the Lunga defenders that the brunt of the attack would fall in the west. Maruyama's forces, unknown to the Americans, were meanwhile slowly approaching the perimeter. Without good military maps, the Japanese commanders were meeting difficulty in finding their way. When advance elements of the enveloping force failed to cross the upper Lunga before 19 October, Maruyama postponed the attack date until 22 October. The first ground action occurred in the Matanikau area on 20 October, when a Japanese combat patrol from Sumiyoshi's force approached the west bank of the river. The patrol, which included 2 tanks, withdrew after a 37mm gun in the sector of the 3D Battalion, 1st Marines, hit 1 tank. At sunset the next evening, after heavy Japanese artillery fire, 9 Japanese tanks supported by infantry came out of the jungle on the west bank to attempt to drive east over the sandbar. But 37mm fire knocked out 1 tank and the force pulled back to the west. No Japanese infantry appeared on 22 October, but Sumiyoshi's artillery kept firing. On 22 October, Maruyama, still short of his line of departure, put off the attack date to 23 October. On that date, he postponed it until 24 October. The 23rd of October was a quiet day until 18 o'clock, when Sumiyoshi's artillery began to fire its heaviest concentrations, up to that time an orthodox preparation on the Matanikau River line, the rear areas, and the coast road. When the fire ceased, a column of 9 18-ton medium tanks appeared out of the jungles to try to smash a passage across the sandbar to penetrate the defences of the 3D Battalion, 1st Marines, while the 4th Infantry assembled in the jungle west of the river. To halt the infantry, the 11th Marines immediately began firing a series of barrages to cover a 600 to 800-yard wide area between the Matanikau River and Point Cruz, while the 37mm guns on the Matanikau engaged the tanks. Not one enemy infantryman succeeded in crossing to the east bank of the river. The anti-tank guns meanwhile wrecked 8 tanks as they rumbled across the sandbar. 1 tank eluded the 37mm fire and crossed the bar to break through the wire entanglements. A Marine rose out of his foxhole and threw a grenade into the tank's tracks. A 75mm self-propelled tank destroyer then approached to fire at close range. The tank ran down the beach into the water, where it stalled, and was finished off by the tank destroyer. The attack having been stopped so abruptly, the surviving Japanese infantrymen withdrew to the west. About midnight, A second Japanese attempt to cross the river farther upstream was easily halted. The jungles west of the river were filled with Japanese corpses, and many enemy dead lay on the sandbar. The 1st Marines, with 25 annihilated and 14 wounded, estimated Japanese losses at 600. Marine patrols later found 3 more wrecked tanks west of the river. They had apparently been destroyed by the 11th Marines' fire before they could reach the Matanikau. Sumiyoshi had sent 1 tank company and 1 infantry regiment forward to attack a prepared position over an obvious approach route, while the Americans were otherwise unengaged. The Maruyama force, still moving inland, had not reached its line of departure. In 1946, the responsible commanders gave different reasons for the lack of coordination and blamed each other. According to Hyakutake, this piecemeal attack had been a mistake. The coastal attack was to have been delivered at the same time as Maruyama's forces struck against the southern perimeter line. Maruyama, according to Hyakutake, was to have notified the 4th Infantry when he had reached his line of departure on 23 October, and he so notified the 4th Infantry. That regiment then proceeded with its attack. Maruyama disclaimed responsibility for the blunder and blamed 17th Army headquarters. His forces, delayed in their difficult march, had not reached their line of departure on 23 October. The 17th Army, he asserted, overestimated the rate of progress on the south flank and ordered the coast forces to attack on 23 October to guarantee success on the south flank. Sumiyoshi was vague. He claimed that throughout the counteroffensive he had been so weakened by malaria that he had found it difficult to make decisions. Despite an earlier statement that he did not know why the attack of 23 October had been ordered, he declared that he had attacked ahead of Maruyama to divert the Americans. Communication between the 2 forces, he claimed, had been very poor. Radio sets gave off too much light, and thus had been used only in the daylight hours. Telephone communication had been frequently disrupted. As a result, the coast force had been 1 day behind in its knowledge of Maruyama's movements. On 24 October, the day after Sumiyoshi's abortive attack, the Lunga perimeter was fairly quiet during the morning hours. Japanese artillery fire continued intermittently during the entire day and annihilated 6 and wounded 25 Marines. In the afternoon, 2 events indicated that the situation was becoming serious for the Americans. Men of the 3D Battalion, 7th Marines, holding the southeast line of the forward Matanikau position along Hill 67, observed a Japanese column passing eastward over Mount Austin's open foothills about 1,000 yards south of their lines. This column, whose exact composition is doubtful, is reported to have been commanded by Colonel Oka. It had apparently crossed the upper Matanikau in an effort to outflank the forward Matanikau position. Battalions of the 11th Marines immediately put fire on the area, and aircraft rose to strafe and bomb it. But the column had disappeared among jungled ravines, and the effects of the bombing and shelling were probably slight. As earlier patrols had reported that the upper reaches of the Lunga River were clear of the enemy, the 2nd Battalion of the 7th Marines had been withdrawn from Sector 3 east of the Lunga prior to Sumiyoshi's attack on 23 October. The entire 2,800-yard front, from the Lunga River over Vicious Ridge to the right flank of the 164th Infantry, was turned over to the 1st Battalion of the 7th Marines, commanded by Colonel Puller. The 2nd Battalion of the 7th was ordered to the Matanikau to relieve the 3D Battalion of the 1st Marines. But following the Sumiyoshi attack on 23 October and the observation of the enemy column the next afternoon, the 2nd Battalion of the 7th Marines, on 24 October, moved hastily into position to cover the gap between the Matanikau line and the Lunga perimeter. It held over 4,000 yards of front along the line between the left flank of the 3D Battalion, 7th, and the 5th Marines in the Lunga perimeter. The discovery of Oka's column east of the Matanikau was followed by evidence that another sector was in danger. A straggler from a 7th Marines patrol returned to the perimeter in the late afternoon to report that he had seen a Japanese officer studying Vicious Ridge through field glasses. At the same time, a Marine from the Scout Sniper Detachment reported that he had seen the smoke of many rice fires rising from the jungle near the horseshoe bend of the Lunga River, about 1.75 miles south of the southern slopes of Vicious Ridge. It was too late in the day for further defensive measures, and the 1st Battalion of the 7th Marines, spread thinly over its long front, awaited the attack. There were then available few troops which were not already in the front lines. The Motorized Division Reserve, bivouacked north of Henderson Field, consisted of the 3D Battalion, 2nd Marines. The only other uncommitted infantry troops in the perimeter were the reserve battalions in each regimental sector. By 24 October, Maruyama's infantry forces had finally crossed the Lunga River and moved into position in the dark jungles east of the Lunga and south of Vicious Ridge. On the left, west, the 29th Infantry, with the 16th in reserve, prepared to attack on a narrow front, while the Kawaguchi force, now commanded by Colonel Toshinari Shoji, prepared to attack farther east. The heaviest weapons for supporting the infantry were machine guns. All the artillery pieces and mortars had been abandoned along the line of march. Maruyama hoped that bright moonlight would provide enough light for his attacking troops to maintain their direction, but clouds and heavy rainfall made the night black. The early evening hours of 24 October were quiet. A Marine listening post east of Vicious Ridge briefly opened fire about 21:30. The front then lay quiet until half an hour after midnight, when Japanese infantrymen, firing rifles, throwing grenades and shouting their battle cries, suddenly sprang out of the jungle to try to cross the fields of fire on the left center of the 1st Battalion of the 7th Marines east of Vicious Ridge. This was the 29th Infantry's attack, the only attack delivered by the Japanese that night. Shoji's wing, attempting to reach the perimeter in the black, rainy night, had lost direction and got in behind the 29th Infantry. The confused battalions were immediately ordered to the front but arrived too late to participate in the night's action. At the first attacks by the 29th Infantry, troops on the right flank of the 2nd Battalion of the 164th Infantry opened fire to assist the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines. Division headquarters correctly assessed the significance of the Japanese attack. It immediately ordered the 3-Dan Battalion of the 164th Infantry, then in regimental reserve in the 164th Sector, to proceed to the front and reinforce the Marine Battalion by detachments, for the 1st Battalion, 7th, was holding a long front against heavy odds. The division reserve was not committed. The Army Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Robert K. Hall, was then in bivouac south of Henderson Field, about 1 mile from the front lines. The rain was still falling heavily, and visibility was poor. By 2 o'clock, the assembled battalion, about to engage the Japanese infantry for the first time, had marched out of its bivouac area. While the Marine Battalion continued to hold back the Japanese, the soldiers entered the lines by detachments between 2 30 amperes, M and 3 30 amperes, M, 25th October. The night was so dark that the Marines guided the soldiers into position practically by hand. The 2 battalions as disposed that night did not defend separate sectors, but were intermingled along the front. In the first wild minutes of battle, the 29th Infantry overran some of the American positions. One platoon captured 2 mortar positions but was immediately destroyed by Puller's forces. The 11th Marines began firing barrages in depth in front of the threatened sector and maintained the fire throughout the engagement. The Japanese attacked with characteristic resolution all through the night, but every charge was beaten back by the concentrated fire of American small arms, heavy weapons and artillery. The rifle companies were supported by the Marine heavy weapons and artillery, by the weapons of M Company, by 1 heavy machine gun section of H Company, and by 37mm anti-tank guns of the 164th Infantry. That night M Company fired 1,281mm mortar rounds. The line threw back a series of separate infantry attacks. It neither broke nor retreated, although some Japanese, including Colonel Masajiro Furumiya of the 29th Infantry, penetrated to the jungle behind the American lines. By 7 o'clock, 25th October, the Japanese attacks had temporarily ceased. Maruyama was withdrawing his battalions to regroup and prepare for another attack. The front lines remained quiet throughout the daylight hours of Sunday, 25th October. Japanese artillery and aircraft were so active, however, that veterans of Guadalcanal have named the day Dugout Sunday. Pistol Pete opened up at 8 o'clock to fire for 3 hours at 10-minute intervals. Strong enemy naval forces, which were engaged the next day in the Battle of Santa Cruz, were known to be approaching, and the early hours of Dugout Sunday had found all Guadalcanal aircraft grounded. Fighter Strip No. 1, without matting or natural drainage, had been turned into a sticky bog by the heavy rains. Japanese planes bombed and strafed Lunga Point in 7 separate attacks. Some Japanese pilots, resolutely dive-bombing a group of planes parked in regular formation along the edge of Henderson Field, destroyed a considerable number. These conspicuous targets, however, were non-flying hulks from the boneyard left in the open to deceive the enemy. The operational aircraft had been dispersed and camouflaged. During the morning, 3 Japanese destroyers, having entered Sealark Channel from the north, caught 2 World War I flush-decked American destroyer transports off Kokumbona. Outgunned, the American vessels escaped to the east. The Japanese then opened fire on 2 of the harbour patrol boats from Tulagi, set them ablaze, and ventured within range of the 3D Defence Battalion's 5-inch batteries on the beach. The batteries hit the leading destroyer 3 times, and the enemy ships then pulled out of range. The sun had dried the airfield slightly, and 3 fighters succeeded in taking off to strafe the destroyers, which escaped to the north. As the runways became drier, more American planes were able to take to the air to challenge the Japanese overhead, until by evening they had shot down 22 planes in addition to 5 destroyed by anti-aircraft fire. Along the perimeter, the Americans reorganized their lines. The 1st Battalion of the 7th Marines and the 3D Battalion of the 164th Infantry, which had been intermingled during the night, divided the front between them. The Marine Battalion, occupying the sector from the Lunga River to a point about 1,400 yards to the east, covered the south slopes of Vicious Ridge. Hall's battalion took over the sector in low-lying, rough jungle between the Marines' left, east flank and the right flank of the 2nd Battalion of the 164th Infantry. The 3D Battalion, 164th, prepared to defend its sector with 3 companies in line L on the left, K in the centre and I on the right. The 60mm mortars were emplaced behind the lines to put fire directly in front of the barbed wire. 81mm mortars, behind the light mortars, were to hit the edge of the jungle beyond the cleared fields of fire, which ranged in depth from 60 to 100 yards. 4 37mm guns covered the junction of the 2nd and 3D battalions of the 164th Infantry, where a narrow trail led north to the Lunga road net. The 164th Infantry Regimental Reserve, consisting of 175 men of the service and anti-tank companies, bivouacked in the 3D battalion's old positions. To the west, in Sector 5, the 5th Marines swung their line southwestward to close with the left flank of the 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines. During the day, the soldiers and Marines, besides strengthening their positions, improving fields of fire, and cleaning and sighting their weapons, hunted down a number of Japanese who had penetrated the perimeter during the night. Hidden in the jungle south of the perimeter, Maruyama was preparing to attack again. Acting on a false report that an American force was approaching his right, east flank, he deployed Shoji's wing on the right to cover his supposedly threatened flank. The attack against the perimeter was to be delivered by 2 infantry regiments in line, the 16th on the right and the 29th on the left. After nightfall on Dugout Sunday, Maruyama's forces struck again in the same pattern as on the previous night. The 16th and 29th Infantry Regiments attacked along the entire front of the 2 American battalions, which had defeated the 29th Infantry the night before. Supported by machine gun fire, groups of from 30 to 200 attacked the perimeter in the darkness. They executed one strong attack against the point of contact of the 2nd and 3D battalions of the 164th Infantry, where the trail led northward. 2 enemy heavy weapons companies covered by riflemen repeatedly drove in toward the trail, but they were driven off or annihilated by canister from the 37mm guns and by fire from the weapons of the 3D and 2nd battalions of the 164th Infantry. About 250 Japanese were annihilated in their attempt to seize the trail. 1 company of the Division Reserve went forward to support L Company of the 164th, and 1 platoon of G Company, 164th, moved south to support L Company and E Company on L's left. The 164th Regimental Reserve was alerted in the event of a breakthrough, but again the lines held. The 16th and 29th Regiments pressed their attacks until daylight, but everyone was beaten off. As day broke on 26 October, the shattered Japanese forces again withdrew into the cover of the jungle. Hyakutake's main effort had failed. Elsewhere, during the night of 25-26 October, the enemy attacked with slightly greater immediate success. Okar's force, which had been observed crossing Mount Austin's foothills the day before, struck north at the attenuated line of the 2nd Battalion of the 7th Marines east of Hill 67. The Japanese broke through at one point, but before they could consolidate their positions, Major Odell M. Connolly, a Marine staff officer, leading headquarters personnel, special weapons troops, bandsmen, and 1 platoon of the 1st Marines, hastily contrived a counterattack and drove the Japanese off the ridge. The unsuccessful night attacks of 25-26 October marked the end of the ground phase of the October counteroffensive. The Japanese forces began a general withdrawal about 29 October. There were no more infantry attacks. American patrols were able to advance 2,500 yards south of the perimeter without encountering any organized Japanese forces. They found only sniping riflemen, small patrols, and bands of stragglers. The defeated enemy forces were retreating eastward and westward to Coley Point and to Kokumbona. The Americans had won the battle handily. Their employment of their weapons had been skillful and effective. The infantrymen, though outnumbered, had stayed at their posts in the face of determined enemy attacks. The soldiers of the 164th Infantry had done well in their first action. Colonel Hall's battalion had, in the words of General Vandegrift, arrived in time to prevent a serious penetration of the position, and by reinforcing the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines throughout its sector, made possible the repulse of continued enemy attacks. The 1st Division is proud to have serving with it another unit which has stood the test of battle and demonstrated an overwhelming superiority over the enemy. The Japanese counteroffensive, which had been begun with such high hopes, was a costly failure. The 1st Marine Division conservatively reported that some 2,200 Japanese soldiers had been annihilated. A later Army report estimated that the combat strength of the 16th and 29th Regiments had been reduced by 3,568. By November, effective strength of the 4th Infantry numbered only 403. Over 1,500 decaying Japanese bodies lay in front of the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, and the 3D Battalion, 164th Infantry. The latter regiment buried 975 enemy bodies in front of K and L companies alone. Among the dead Japanese were General Nasu and Colonels Furumiya and Toshiro Hiroyasu commanding the 29th and 16th Regiments respectively. By comparison, American losses had been light. The 164th Infantry reported 26 annihilated, 4 missing, and 52 wounded throughout October. The bombardment of the Lunga airfields had been by far the most successful phase of the Japanese counteroffensive. However, the Japanese might have achieved greater success had the air and naval bombardments been delivered simultaneously with the infantry attacks. The infantry attacks, usually delivered against battalions by forces in regimental strength, had failed completely. Japanese coordination, as exemplified by the operations of Sumiyoshi and Maruyama, had been poor, and the attacks had been delivered in piecemeal fashion. If Oka's attack had been intended to divert the Americans, it came 48 hours too late to be effective. The fact that Maruyama was able to move his troops inland around Mount Austin in secret was a signal demonstration of the skill and doggedness of the Japanese soldier, but the terrain over which the intended envelopment had been executed had prevented the movement of artillery. The heavy artillery in Kokumbona does not appear to have been used in direct support of Maruyama's attacks. Maruyama's night attacks were thus made by infantrymen against prepared positions supported by artillery and heavy weapons. As the circular perimeter line possessed no open flanks, the Japanese delivered frontal attacks. The Lunga airfields, though seriously threatened, were saved by a combination of Japanese recklessness and American skill and bravery. The naval phase of the October counteroffensive was concluded almost anticlimactically by the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands on 26 October. South Pacific naval forces had been preparing to meet the attack since early October. On 20 October, the Joint Chiefs of Staff transferred the submarines of the Southwest Pacific Naval Forces to the South Pacific until the completion of the Guadalcanal campaign, and Admiral Nimitz promised to send more submarines from the Pacific Fleet. The Southwest Pacific submarines were ordered to attack warships, tankers, transports, and supply ships in the vicinity of Fazy, Rabaul, Buka, northern New Georgia, Kavieng, Bougainville Strait, Indispensable Strait, and Cape Cretin on the Huon Peninsula in New Guinea. On 24 October, the Enterprise and her escorts rendezvoused with the Hornet Task Group northeast of the New Hebrides. The task force thus assembled, commanded by Rear Admiral Thomas C. Kinkaid, included the 2 carrier groups, the Enterprise, South Dakota, 1 heavy cruiser, 1 light anti-aircraft cruiser, and 8 destroyers, and the Hornet with 2 heavy and 2 light anti-aircraft cruisers and 6 destroyers. A strong Japanese fleet, consisting of 4 carriers, 4 battleships, 9 cruisers, 28 destroyers, 4 oilers, and 3 cargo ships, had meanwhile been maneuvering off the Santa Cruz Islands in support of the 1/7th Army, at 10 amperes m of 26 October, while the 1/7th Army forces were attacking Lunga Point. A patrolling plane reported to Admiral Kinkaid's force that it had discovered part of the enemy fleet near the Santa Cruz Islands. Kinkaid moved in to attack. The ensuing engagement, a series of aircraft attacks against both planes and surface ships, was less decisive than the ground operations on Guadalcanal. The outnumbered American force lost 20 planes to the enemy and 54 more from other causes. The Hornet and the destroyer Porter were sunk, and the Enterprise, the South Dakota, and the light anti-aircraft cruiser San Juan and the destroyer Smith suffered damage. All the enemy ships remained afloat, but 3 carriers and 2 destroyers were damaged. The Japanese lost 100 planes, a loss which may have limited the amount of air cover they were able to provide to their convoys in November. At the conclusion of the day's action, the Japanese fleet withdrew and returned to Truk, not because it had been defeated, but because the 1/7th Army had failed. The Santa Cruz engagement proved to be the last action of the Guadalcanal campaign in which the Japanese employed aircraft carriers in close support. Thus far in the campaign, Allied air and naval forces had fought valiantly, but had not yet achieved the result which is a requisite to a successful landing on a hostile island, the destruction or effective interdiction of the enemy's sea and air potential, to prevent him from reinforcing his troops on the island, and to prevent him from cutting the attacker's line of communication. This decisive result was soon to be gained.